But leave the wise to wrangle, and with me the quarrel of the universe let be, and in some corner of the hubbub couched, make game of that which makes as much of thee. In 1856, the British professor Edward Cowell found in Calcutta a manuscript of the Rubaiyat, a collection of poetry by the 11th century Persian astronomer and mathematician Omar Khayyam. He sent a copy of this manuscript along with another found at Oxford to his friend, the poet Edward Fitzgerald. What emerged from this exchange some years later was the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, now considered one of the greatest and most popular poems in the English language. But how did Fitzgerald manage to present and popularize the thoughts of 11th century Persia in 19th century Britain? Was he able to convey all the meanings present within the Rubaiyat? In this video, I use the example of wine in the Rubaiyat to discuss how Fitzgerald may have faltered in his translation. Fitzgerald assumed that when Khayyam mentioned his love for wine, he meant that literally. But I will argue that Khayyam may have used the metaphor of wine to hide a spiritual meaning within hedonistic poetry. I will also talk about how Khayyam wished to defy all rational philosophies, siding neither with hedonism nor with the organized Sufi philosophy which, by his time, had also become dogmatic. Fitzgerald's attempts to label Khayyam as an Epicurean, therefore, may be just as misguided as the efforts of his Persian followers to label him a Sufi. Come fill the cup and in the fire of spring, the winter garment of repentance fling. The bird of time has but a little way to fly, and lo, the bird is on the wing. Given the vast gap of time and place between Khayyam and himself, Fitzgerald knew that a literal translation of the Rubaiyat would not adequately explain what he believed to be the hedonistic philosophy underlying the text. Without the removal of significant historical references in the verses, the work would be incomprehensible to the contemporary Western reader. But at the same time, Fitzgerald was writing his poem during the Victorian Age, the period of colonial conquest and Orientalism. The contemporary reader sought a distinctly Oriental text and would not appreciate a westernized Khayyam. But Fitzgerald lacked any respect for this contemporary taste and avoided all pressure to Orientalize his poem. What really drove him in his translation was his identification with Khayyam, in whom he saw a fellow skeptic, a hedonist, who did not identify with the religious dogma and morality of his time. He saw in Khayyam a cynic, a mirror to Fitzgerald's vision of himself as a bohemian critic of Victorian morality. This was an attempt at collapsing the temporal and cultural barriers between Khayyam and himself, invoking a kinship of philosophy that transcended all other barriers. So if a literal translation was out of the question, Fitzgerald's vision of Khayyam as a mirror of himself would drive his translation, which he would present as a continuous story, a narrative. This decision, I will now argue, was crucial for the transformation of Khayyam's poetry in its English translation. This is because Khayyam never published a book with the title The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. In fact, he was not even recognized as a poet by his contemporaries and was widely known only for his mathematical and astronomical discoveries. The Persian word Rubaiyat simply means a collection of rubai, which is a quatrain, a verse following the A-A-B-A rhyming format. But a rubai is an absolutely complete and isolated unit. In other words, the quatrains, or Rubaiyat, found in the two manuscripts attributed to Khayyam were self-contained units, which were never meant to tell a continuous narrative, except perhaps for the discourse of the pots or Kuza-nama, which is translated towards the middle of Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat. More importantly, these manuscripts were compiled centuries after Khayyam's death, and so there is no possible way to prove which of these quatrains were his work and which were later additions, as he published no poetry in his lifetime. Fitzgerald's decision to produce a single narrative from the Rubaiyat reduced the text to a single philosophy, the philosophy of Epicureanism, an ancient Greek school of thought which was undergoing a revival in 19th century Britain. As a response to the Puritan morality of the Victorian era, artists and writers sought refuge in the teachings of Epicurus, who argued that the maximization of pleasure and the avoidance of pain was the goal of human life. Epicurus encouraged his followers to focus on maximizing their happiness in this world and to not be concerned about the prospects of an afterlife or other divine phenomena, even if they existed. This emphasis on maximizing pleasure in one's life is also known as hedonism. How long, in infinite pursuit of this and that endeavor and dispute? Better be merry with the fruitful grape than sadden after none or bitter fruit. In Khayyam, Fitzgerald saw a Persian celebration of the Epicurean spirit, intended as a revolt against the moral rigidity of Islam. He viewed Khayyam as a preserver of the Epicurean spirit of ancient Persia against the quote-unquote imported ideology of Islam imposed by the Arab conquest. Islam for Fitzgerald was an artificial imposition which had ruined the glory of ancient Persia. This bigoted understanding of Islam, combined with his Epicurean imagination of Khayyam as a precursor to himself, precluded a Sufi interpretation of the Rubaiyat. Dreaming when dawn's left hand was in the sky, I heard a voice within the tavern cry, "Awake, my little ones, and fill the cup, before life's liquor in its cup be dry." The celebration of liquor, specifically wine, in Khayyam's quatrains was understood by Fitzgerald to be a literal preference for alcoholism by the poet. The passage that I just read out is towards the beginning of the Rubaiyat. Now read the final passage. "And when thyself with shining foot shall pass, among the guests are scattered on the grass, and in thy joyous errand reach the spot, where I made one turn down an empty glass." So, Fitzgerald's narrative presents a journey from dawn in the tavern when the drinking begins and continues through a wide rumination on the evanescence of our existence, and pleasure through wine and song as the only happiness we can earn in life. And finally ends with Khayyam advising us to turn down an empty glass. This would mean that the Rubaiyat is a cyclical text of unceasing alcoholism. Fitzgerald adamantly stuck to his opinion that Khayyam, in professing his love for wine, meant nothing but the veritable juice of the grape. He viewed himself as a defender of Khayyam against the Sufis, who had claimed ownership of Khayyam by arguing that the intoxication of wine in the Rubaiyat was a metaphor for the spiritual experience of self-annihilation in the divine, or fana, the goal of Sufism. The influence of the Sufis also spread to the 19th century West, including to Cowell, who was unsure if wine in the Rubaiyat was to be interpreted literally, and J.B. Nicholas, the French translator of the Rubaiyat, who counted Khayyam among the Sufi poets of Persia. Fitzgerald may have found his position strengthened by the fact that Khayyam, in multiple passages, attacks the Sufis, proclaiming the supremacy of his wine to their faith. "The wine had struck a fibre which about it clings my being, let the Sufi flout. Of my base metal may be filed a key that shall unlock the door he howls without." But it is worth investigating this verse in greater detail. The Sufis here are presented as howling, seeking to unlock the door. But Khayyam says that the wine which the Sufis flout will help his base metal create a key that shall unlock the door sought by the Sufi. If the base metal here is presumably a reference to his body, could it be possible that the door to be unlocked is a certain mystical experience, outside of or greater than the body and its reality, accessible once the key of passage into this experience is derived from the body? Spiritual possibilities abound under this interpretation. Some greater context related to the Persian poetry of Khayyam's time strengthens this interpretation. The Persian tradition of Sufi poetry has expressed longing for the divine through the twin metaphors of wine and the beloved, the lover. Many in the Sufi tradition have understood Khayyam's obsession with wine as a manifestation of this very longing. Multiple interpreters since Fitzgerald, possessing a cultural context more sympathetic to the Sufi tradition, have interpreted Khayyam to be a Sufi. For instance, the Hindi poet Harivansh Rai Bachchan wrote his Madhushala inspired by the Rubaiyat and later even translated the Rubaiyat into Hindi. Bachchan's environment may be considered more sympathetic to Sufism, given the prevalence of Sufi thought in North India in the early 20th century. In direct contradiction to Fitzgerald, Bachchan interprets wine in the Rubaiyat to be a metaphor for an intoxication derived from spiritual experience, and extends this metaphor in his Madhushala. This provides a starkly different view of the Rubaiyat compared to Fitzgerald, whose literal interpretation of wine in the poetry of an Islamic society renders the content of the poem irreligious, if not an act of blasphemy. But it is possible that Khayyam too may have employed this very taboo associated with wine to make it a metaphor for an independent spiritual experience that goes against the dogma of all organized religion, including Sufism, as well as the established rational philosophies of his time. This role of wine in inducing what I call a post-rational experience is presented in the following verse. You know, my friends, how long since in my house, for a new marriage I did make carouse, divorced old parent Reason from my bed, and took the daughter of the wine to spouse. Here, Khayyam presents two marriages as two contrasting preferences. The first marriage, to personified reason, is a reference to his earlier preference for rational philosophy and science. But Reason is now found to be an old and barren spouse, and so is divorced from his bed. The barrenness of Reason references its incapacity to produce a particular unspecified state, which accepts the metaphor of childbirth. The second marriage then is made to the daughter of the vine. By virtue of being referred to as a daughter and hence youthful, Khayyam implies that vine is fertile and not barren like old Reason. Khayyam therefore seeks an experience that goes beyond the rational mind. Having found the inability, or barrenness as he puts it, of reason in producing pleasure, Khayyam divorces reason, quitting rational philosophy and the sciences. The fact that Khayyam was primarily an astronomer and mathematician and not a poet is relevant to this interpretation. Quitting his scientific pursuits, if we interpret the verse literally, he now takes to drinking wine for the maximization of his pleasure. A Sufi interpretation of this verse, however, would continue with interpreting wine as a post-rational experience. The tradition of Sufism also views spiritual experience as post-rational, making it akin to the intoxication of wine. The metaphor of inebriation for spiritual experience would highlight the fact that Sufism is an unorthodox movement that was disapproved, much like alcohol, by Orthodox Islam, which may symbolize the old and barren reason that Khayyam has divorced. But what about Khayyam's earlier attack against the Sufis? The Sufis are howling, performing acts that do not unlock the door. This is to say that they are engaged in religious activities which do not cause true spiritual experience, a state that is only accessible through his wine. His wine is therefore one not available to the Sufi. The interpretation of wine as a spiritual reality also brings new force to the final verse of Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat, which I read out previously. The advice to turn down an empty glass now becomes a solemn acceptance of death, to forget or turn down the body, the empty glass, once the spirit, that is the wine, has left it. So it seems to me that despite Fitzgerald's attempt to create an Epicurean narrative out of the Rubaiyat, a potential spiritual meaning continues to underlie the text once the literal interpretation of wine is abandoned. The grape that can with logic absolute, the 270 jarring sects confute, the subtle alchemist that in a trice life's leaden metal into gold transmute. Finally, given the fact that different scholars have interpreted Khayyam's philosophy in widely different and even opposing ways, it is worth asking if Khayyam deliberately intended to present a paradoxical philosophy, with the intention of confusing his readers. Some scholars have argued that the only way to view the Rubaiyat as a single text is to admit that the poem lacks philosophical coherence. I argue that this is a natural outcome of Khayyam's usage of wine as a post-rational entity. By virtue of being beyond reason, wine can be interpreted as a part of all philosophies, but also beyond them. Wine drinking, in an Islamic context, can be seen as a symbol of liberty, of the freedom of rational thought, but also of freedom in spiritual experience. So, due to his embrace of the wine, Khayyam's views cannot be defined in any rational manner. His view is the renunciation of all views, much like the Indian Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna. See this verse, for example. Myself when young did eagerly frequent, doctor and saint, and heard great argument, about it and about, but evermore, came out by the same door as in I went. Here, both the doctor, that is, the rational philosopher or the scientist, as well as the saint, presumably the Sufi, are ridiculed as pastimes of Khayyam's youth, both of whom are now to be renounced in favor of wine. The saint is rejected much like the doctor because both can only offer great argument about metaphysical realities. Wine, instead, is the only substance that can offer experience. The logic absolute of wine overpowers the rational logic of the 72 sects, a traditional number for all the religions of the world in Persian literature, according to Fitzgerald. The search for rational knowledge of the absolute is now deemed impossible. The very purpose of the Rubaiyat then was to bewilder all those who seek meaning in it. It is this very celebration of incoherence that marks the role of wine as a post-rational experience in the Rubaiyat. I argue that Fitzgerald's efforts to see Epicurus in Khayyam are futile, in just the same way in reducing Khayyam to a coherent, rational philosophy, seeking the maximization of pleasure. And if the tavern were to be seen as a temple, and the drinker as a worshipper, the Sufi possibilities of the Rubaiyat cannot be dismissed. Ah, my beloved, fill the cup that clears, today of past regrets and future fears. Tomorrow, why tomorrow I may be, myself with yesterday's 7,000 years. The literary scholar Harold Bloom includes Fitzgerald's work in his anthology of English poetry, as he considered it an independent work and not a translation of a Persian original. Similarly, the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges even claimed that Fitzgerald invented an English poet by the name of Omar Khayyam. Yet Fitzgerald himself seemed to subscribe to the view that the author, Khayyam, was clearly visible in his text, arguing that the poet was not lost in his song. After everything that I've discussed in this video, I think that Fitzgerald's work, like all other translations of poetry, must be seen as his own independent work, an imitation inspired by Khayyam's Rubaiyat. Those who read with an Epicurean lens, like Fitzgerald, will also find their beloved drunkard, ruminating on the shortness of life and the futility of existence without pleasure. But despite his own Epicurean understanding of Khayyam's philosophy, it can still be seen that multiple spiritual interpretations remain possible, even within Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat. Oh, come with old Khayyam and leave the wise. To talk, one thing is certain, that life flies. One thing is certain and the rest is lies. The flower that once has blown forever dies. If you've made it this far, I'd like to thank you for watching this video. On this channel, I will be making more videos soon, analyzing some of my favorite books, primarily in literature and philosophy, films and music. If you'd like to read more about this topic, I've noted my references for this video in the description below. Thanks again for watching and see you soon.